I had read the Bible, lots of parts of the Bible before, but one thing that I had never actually tried to do is simply try to understand it in the way that the Christians understand it.
How did this skeptic professor change his entire worldview?
And what was amazing to me is that when I looked up the answers to my many, many skeptical questions, saved up over the years, I was kind of shocked to discover that not only were there answers to all of my questions, they had thought of many more questions I hadn't thought of, in some cases maybe even better questions, and they also had answers to them. The answers, increasingly, as I went through the Bible and put them together, made a certain kind of coherent sense.
In today's episode, you're about to hear from Dr. Larry Sanger, the co-founder of Wikipedia and a former atheist with a PhD in philosophy. Once a committed naturalist, Larry dismissed all things supernatural, until something changed. He opened the Bible with a skeptical mind, and walked away transformed. Today, he sits down with Dr. Frank Turek to explain what he found inside the Bible, why it withstood his toughest questions, and how that journey led him to Jesus. If you care about truth, evidence, or philosophy, this conversation is going to challenge what you think you know.
How does a philosopher, a skeptic, somebody who helped create, a co-founder of Wikipedia, go from someone who believed in naturalism, that all there are natural laws, there's no supernatural, you don't have a mind, you just have a brain, you don't have a soul, you just have a body, everything is caused by the laws of physics, you're nothing but a moist robot. How did those beliefs eventually get to the point where Dr. Larry Sanger is now a Christian who believes in the supernatural? And of course, Jesus is God. Jesus is our Savior. How did all that happen? We're talking about it here, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Just before the break, Larry, you were explaining how there's this scaffolding of order out there, and all these laws and constants that make up our universe have to have an ultimate source in a mind. Now, I noticed in your testimony, you rightfully point out that this doesn't necessarily prove the Christian God, because you would need some evidence from history and Jesus to see if it's the Christian God. But how were you led from the idea that there's a designer out there to the idea that that designer is Jesus himself?
Well, it's interesting. There are so many different components to the explanation. Ultimately, it has to do with the fact that I read the Bible. So I can tell that story if you like.
In fact, I want to, if it's okay, I want to read, if I can find it here, this paper that Larry put together, ladies and gentlemen, is fascinating, and I highly encourage you to read it. Again, it's in the show notes. The title of it is How a Skeptical Philosopher Became a Christian by Dr. Larry Sanger. And why don't you start your explanation? I'm going to read something from your
Sure.
when I find it, but go ahead.
So, as I say, there are many different moving parts. It wasn't just one thing. One of the parts was in 2019, just before everybody started learning about Jeffrey Epstein. I actually started learning about Jeffrey Epstein from a friend of mine. And he was telling me about how, on his view, the people who violate children systematically are actually secretly occultists, and that this is actually important to understanding why this stuff takes place at all. And I could not really believe it, but he kept pushing me in to look at the symbology and consider certain books that had been written, the Freemason history and so forth. And at a certain point, I said, well, if there's anything to this, because these people actually do seem to take their beliefs very seriously, and it has a real effect on their behavior. I'm not saying that everything that my friend said was true, but it became clear to me that yes, there are a lot of influential people who have a lot of what I would consider creepy beliefs.
Mm.
And I didn't want to read, these books by Helena Blavatsky and Albert Pike and all the rest of these people. If there was any sort of spirit realm, I knew I wanted to be on the side of the angels. I always said that. And I said, well, if I'm really going to understand this stuff, then I need to read the Bible. Because basically the occult is a perversion of the ideas in the Bible. It is a deliberate twisting. And so I just put all of that stuff aside for a few months. And then the following winter, I was just looking for some bedtime reading. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, why not the Bible? I did want to go through that systematically at some point. So I said, okay. And within a few days, I had been hooked. I mean, I had read the Bible, lots of parts of the Bible before. But one thing that I had never actually tried to do is simply try to understand it in the way that the Christians understand it. In other words, my topic was not to decide what I think about the Bible. It's like, okay, because that was old hat to me. I knew what I thought about the Bible, but I didn't know what the Christians really thought about the Bible. I had not tried to make sense of that. And what was amazing to me is that when I looked up the answers to my many, many skeptical questions, saved up over the years, I was kind of shocked to discover that not only were there answers to all of my questions, they had thought of many more questions I hadn't thought of, in some cases, maybe even better questions. And they also had answers to them. The answers, increasingly, as I went through the Bible and put them together, made a certain kind of coherent sense. Now, I'm not saying that I just read the Bible and I started believing it. And of course, that's not what happened, right? As I said, there are many moving parts. So my reconsideration of the traditional arguments for the existence of God was another one of the parts. And another part, of course, for sure, is my realization that each individual argument for the existence of God, traditional argument, is not best regarded as having the conclusion, therefore God exists. I actually think it's much more helpful, certainly was more helpful for me at the time, to restrict the claims made by the argument to what is directly supported by the premises. So the conclusion of the argument from contingency is, therefore, a necessarily existent being exists outside of the space-time universe and explains the contingent facts in this universe. That is what is supported by the argument from contingency. And it takes further, but the thing is, when you put all of the conclusions of the various arguments for the existence of God together, in a certain way, which I explored in, let's just say, very doggedly over many months and actually the following years, I came to see just how strong the case was. But it's hard. This is one thing that a lot of skeptics do not understand. And I think a lot of apologists also don't understand, is that it is hard to express all of the reasons that we have for changing an entire worldview. Because when you come to believe a single simple conclusion like God exists or the Christian God exists, there's so much that's packed into that it's just a mistake to suppose that that's the conclusion of a single argument. It represents an entire worldview. And if you want to shift a worldview, then yes, the process of doing that is going to have many different moving parts.
What I found fascinating, and the exact quote I'm looking for, I don't have in front of me, but what I found fascinating, Larry, is that you read the Bible earlier in life and it didn't make the same sort of impression on you. But when you began to read it more critically, actually,
yeah,
you somehow were fascinated to the point that you wrote a 500-page commentary on the book of Genesis. I mean, how did you go from somebody who was apathetic about this series of documents? The Bible's not a book, it's a library of books.
Yes.
But you then dove in full force, and you write in your testimony here that you used to think these things were just written by Bronze Age shepherds.
Uh-huh.
And now that you dive into the actual Bible itself, what did you find that caused you to be fascinated with it to the point that you then went back and looked at the arguments for God and said, they're making more sense now?
Yeah. It's very hard to explain without actually retelling the history of salvation, frankly. I actually think that when you try to grasp what the Bible is saying as a unified story, and it helped that I actually tried to read it in 90 days because it's easier to see when everything is sort of like before you, at a glance, as it were. I was able to sort of reconstruct the Bible story from the fall to the first covenants to the introduction of law to the Davidic dynasty to the Messiah prophecies to the fulfillment of the Messiah prophecies, all the rest of that. I can just summarize it the way that I just did, but it is not the same as actually reading the text and asking hard questions about it and just realizing the text sustains the 2,000-year-old tradition of critical examination of the ideas behind it. That's really something. Right? There are not any gotchas about the Bible that I am scared of at this point. And the thing is that's actually the thing that really surprised me. And when I say that the Bible is a work of really great beauty and wisdom, that's actually a big part of what I mean, that it withstands critical examination. And more than that, actually, it invites it. And you cannot understand a lot that the Bible has to offer if you don't ask hard questions, some of the very hardest questions. You just won't make sense of why it says certain things unless you ask about them and you seek the answers from other parts in the text often.
Dr. Larry Sanger's journey from naturalistic skepticism to Christian conviction is a profound testimony to a timeless biblical promise. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Jeremiah 29 verse 13. His transformation didn't come through blind faith or emotional persuasion. It came through rigorous, honest inquiry. What makes his story so compelling is that he didn't approach the Bible as a believer, but as a philosopher, a co-founder of Wikipedia, no less, accustomed to logic, argument, and evidence. And when he read the Bible not to criticize it, but to understand it from the perspective of those who believe it, the result was revolutionary. He found not only answers to his own long-held objections, but a well of deeper questions and thoughtful, ancient responses that revealed the Bible's enduring intellectual and spiritual depth. The turning point was simple. He genuinely sought truth. And true to God's nature, the truth revealed himself. This reflects Christ's words. Seek, and you will find. Matthew 7 verse 7. God does not hide from those who sincerely desire to know him. Rather, he honors the earnest seeker, even one armed with doubt and skepticism. Larry's realization that the biblical worldview coherently and beautifully explains the universe, from moral order to personal purpose, points to the power of Scripture as divine revelation, not human invention. His story reminds us, belief is not the enemy of reason, truth is its fulfillment. Recommended reading: I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabil Qureshi. The Bible and the Ballot by Tremper Longman III. If you seek the truth honestly, don't be surprised when Jesus finds you.